What would you do if the person you trusted the most shattered your world with a single secret? It started with a gut feeling, a missed call, a misplaced text, and suddenly, everything I thought I knew about my wife, Penelope, was a lie. What came next was a whirlwind, an affair with a high-profile news anchor, a shocking death that made headlines, and a public scandal that tore our family apart. But this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about survival, redemption, and the unexpected ways life forces us to grow. Stick around, because this journey is filled with twists you won't see coming. What happens when the dust settles? Can trust ever be rebuilt? Or do some scars stay forever? Let's find out together. I used to believe in karma, that life has a way of evening the scales. You sow your seeds, and one day, you reap what you've planted. At least, that's what I told myself whenever I felt wronged. But when betrayal comes from the one person you trust the most, you start to question everything. I remember the exact moment it all shifted. One fleeting glance, one unanswered phone call. Little things that shouldn't matter began gnawing at my mind, leaving me wide awake at night, trying to connect dots that didn't quite fit. I wasn't looking for trouble, but it found me anyway. Penelope always had this way of laughing at my cynicism, brushing off my guarded nature. I let her in, gave her every piece of me. But now, those pieces felt scattered, broken beyond repair. A casual, running late text became a dagger to my chest. My gut whispered things I didn't want to hear. Every relationship has its cracks, but ours seemed unbreakable. At least, that's what I thought. Slowly, though, I started noticing the moments she seemed miles away, even when sitting across the table. A forgotten detail here, a sudden meeting there. Was it paranoia? Or was the truth right there, just waiting for me to open my eyes? The weight of suspicion pressed on me, heavier with every passing day. Yet, despite it all, I didn't want to believe it. Isn't that what love is? A blind faith that somehow shields you from the worst? I told myself I was imagining things, that karma would handle whatever this was. But the cracks were growing wider, and the shadows they cast were impossible to ignore. I don't know when I first realized it wasn't just my imagination. Maybe it was that afternoon when Penelope came home smelling like cologne that wasn't mine. Or the way she flinched when I asked her about her day, as if my curiosity had suddenly become invasive. It didn't take long for my mind to spiral into scenarios I didn't want to face. Still, I clung to denial until I couldn't anymore. Fred Desmond. His name alone sent a chill down my spine the first time I heard it. He was everywhere, on TV screens, billboards, even in our conversations, dropped casually like he was just another face in the crowd. But deep down, I knew better. There was an ease in the way she spoke of him, a lightness in her voice that I hadn't heard in a long time. I tried convincing myself it was harmless. They worked together, late hours, shared projects, it was normal. Wasn't it? But then I found the text. It wasn't explicit, nothing outright damning. Just a little too warm, too personal for my comfort. My heart sank as I scrolled, each message feeling like a punch to the gut. My hands shook, but I couldn't stop reading. That text was the tipping point. Suddenly, every smile, every excuse, every lingering glance felt like confirmation. The worst part? She had no idea I knew. I found myself in a twisted game of pretend, acting as though everything was fine while my world crumbled beneath me. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how hard you try to keep it buried. I thought discovering the affair would be the worst of it. Turns out I didn't know what worst really looked like. That night, Penelope left again, another late meeting, another flimsy excuse. I stayed up pacing the living room, drowning in the weight of everything I wasn't saying. But when she came back, her face told me something had happened, something bigger than I could have ever imagined. She didn't say much at first, just stood there in the doorway, pale and trembling. My stomach churned. Was this guilt finally catching up to her? But then the words spilled out, tumbling over each other in a mess of panic and disbelief. Fred Desmond, the man who had managed to destroy everything I thought I knew about my marriage, was dead. I didn't know what to feel. Relief? Anger? A strange, bitter satisfaction crept in. Karma, I thought. But there was no joy in her face, just shock. She said he collapsed during one of their meetings. His heart, she claimed, gave out right there in front of her. My mind raced with questions I couldn't voice. What was he to her, really? And why did she look so devastated? The news broke on every channel the next day. Fred Desmond, beloved news anchor, gone too soon. People mourned. Tributes poured in. And me? I was caught between the absurdity of it all and the twisted satisfaction of watching the perfect man crumble in the public eye. But as much as I wanted this to be the end, I knew this was only the beginning. When the news broke, it wasn't just me who felt the ripples. Our kids, oblivious to the chaos brewing beneath the surface, found themselves caught in the undertow. It started with whispers at school, teachers speaking in hushed tones, classmates asking awkward questions they didn't know how to answer. Watching their confusion cut deeper than I expected. Penelope tried to hold it together, but I could see the cracks. She fumbled through explanations, deflecting the hard truths with half-hearted reassurances. The kids didn't need specifics to sense something was wrong. They looked at her differently now, like they were trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. And me? I stayed quiet, torn between protecting them and wanting to unload everything. One evening, our eldest, Maddie, asked why the reporters kept calling Mom's phone. Her voice was small, uncertain, and it broke something inside me. Penelope froze, her face a mask of guilt and dread. I jumped in, offering some vague excuse about work, but Maddie wasn't buying it. Her eyes flickered between us, searching for a truth she wasn't ready to hear. It was the beginning of a fracture I couldn't mend. Every day felt heavier, the silence at dinner louder than ever. I wanted to shield them from this storm, but the damage was done. I could feel the weight of their unasked questions hanging in the air, and I knew the worst was yet to come. It didn't take long for the media frenzy to spiral out of control. Fred Desmond's death wasn't just news, it was a spectacle. Every network clamored for details, spinning stories that blurred the lines between fact and fiction. And there we were, dragged into the chaos, unable to escape the flashing cameras and relentless whispers. Penelope became the center of it all. They painted her as the grieving colleague, the mysterious woman at the scene of Fred's collapse. But I knew better, and soon, so did everyone else. It started with a leaked photo, Penelope and Fred together, smiling in a way that left little room for misinterpretation. The narrative shifted, and the scandal took on a life of its own. Reporters camped outside our house, their questions slicing through the air every time we stepped out. Did you know? How long has it been going on? The accusations weren't just directed at her anymore. They fell on me too. People speculated about our marriage, about how I could have missed the signs. I wanted to shout the truth, but what good would it do? The kids bore the brunt of it in their own way. Friends suddenly distanced themselves. Parents whispered at school pickups. Penelope tried to shield them, but the damage was done. Her once perfect image lay shattered, and in its place was a story too juicy for the world to ignore. I couldn't decide which was worse, the betrayal itself or the fallout we were now drowning in. It all came to a head one evening, just as the house had finally gone quiet. I couldn't hold it in anymore. The betrayal, the lies, the media circus that had turned our lives into a sideshow. Penelope was sitting at the kitchen table, her head buried in her hands. When I stepped in, the words spilled out before I even realized I was speaking. I told her everything. How I'd known about Fred, about their late-night meetings, about the text that had shattered my trust. My voice cracked with a mix of anger and hurt I could no longer contain. She looked up, her eyes wide and tearful, but for once I didn't care. I needed answers, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid to demand them. Her excuses came quickly, too quickly. She claimed it wasn't what it seemed, that I didn't understand. But the problem was I did. I understood all too well. The weight of her betrayal crushed any empathy I might have had. My voice rose, sharp and biting, as years of pent-up frustrations poured out. This wasn't just about Fred. It was about everything we'd let fester between us. And yet, somewhere in the storm of accusations, I caught a glimpse of something in her. A brokenness I didn't recognize. It wasn't enough to stop me, but it lingered, a faint crack in the armor of my anger. When I finally walked away, the house felt heavier than ever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was just the beginning of something far more complicated. Just when I thought the dust might finally settle, life threw another curveball. Penelope sat me down one evening, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of the table. I expected another excuse, another plea for forgiveness. But the words that came out of her mouth sent me spiraling into a silence, so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. She was pregnant. At first, I didn't know what to say. The timing was impossible to ignore. My mind raced through the possibilities, each one more unbearable than the last. My first instinct was denial. This couldn't be happening. But the way she looked at me, like she was bracing for impact, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't my child. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The betrayal had been devastating enough. But this was something else entirely. Penelope tried to explain, her words stumbling over each other in a mess of guilt and desperation. She didn't need to say Fred's name. I could see it in her eyes. That was the final nail in the coffin of whatever hope I had left for us. The news hit our family like a wrecking ball. The kids sensed the tension, though they didn't know the full story yet. I felt trapped between my fury and a strange sense of pity for her. As much as I wanted to walk away, I couldn't ignore the wreckage this was leaving behind. The only question left was how to move forward, if moving forward was even possible. The decision to end it wasn't as clean or swift as I thought it would be. Divorce, it turns out, is less like ripping off a Band-Aid and more like untangling a web you didn't even realize you were trapped in. There were papers to sign, custody agreements to negotiate, and the agonizing process of splitting a life we'd built together. Every step felt like another tiny death. Penelope didn't fight me on it. How could she? But her quiet compliance made it all the more gut-wrenching. She looked like a shadow of the woman I once knew, weighed down by guilt and something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger I felt anymore. It was exhaustion. I just wanted it to be over. I needed to start fresh, even if I wasn't sure how. In the months that followed, I found myself gravitating towards Charlotte, the family therapist we'd brought in to help the kids cope. She had this calming presence, a way of seeing through the mess, and reminding me there was still something worth salvaging. What started as casual conversations turned into something deeper, an unexpected connection that made me believe in the possibility of happiness again. Penelope, meanwhile, seemed to retreat into herself. I caught glimpses of her trying to make amends with the kids, trying to carve out a new version of motherhood amidst the fallout. It was painful to watch, but I couldn't focus on her anymore. My path was veering in a different direction, one that felt lighter, freer, and, for the first time in years, hopeful. I'll admit, part of me didn't think she had it in her. After everything that happened, I figured Penelope would fade into the background, too ashamed to confront the wreckage she'd caused. But life has a strange way of surprising you. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to rebuild. Not for me, not even for herself, but for the kids. At first, it was small gestures. She showed up for every school event, every late-night conversation. She cooked meals from scratch like she used to, even when no one asked her to. The kids were hesitant, guarded, but she didn't push. Her patience was something I hadn't seen in years. It was almost as if she knew this was her last chance to make things right. Still, the road wasn't easy. The whispers hadn't stopped, and neither had the sideways glances at parent-teacher conferences or grocery store checkouts. Penelope bore it all in silence, her head high, but her shoulders heavy. I caught her crying once, late at night, when she thought everyone was asleep. It was strange. I didn't feel pity, but I didn't feel triumph either. Over time, though, her efforts started to pay off. The kids began to let her in, piece by fragile piece. Maddie, ever the skeptic, finally cracked a smile during one of their late-night talks. Watching from the sidelines, I couldn't ignore the determination in her eyes. Maybe redemption wasn't just a word for her. Maybe, against all odds, she was actually earning it. Years passed, but the memories lingered, faint echoes of a life I'd tried to leave behind. By the time I saw her again, I thought I'd buried all the resentment, all the pain. But standing there, face to face with Penelope after so long, I realized how deeply some wounds run. She looked different, not just older, but lighter somehow, like someone who'd finally learned how to breathe. We didn't plan the encounter. It was one of those random moments life throws at you. A coffee shop on a quiet afternoon, her standing in line, me finding a seat by the window. She noticed me first. Her eyes met mine, and for a split second, everything came rushing back. Fred, the scandal, the chaos. But then she smiled. Not a guilty smile or a pleading one. Just a smile. I wasn't sure what to expect when I walked over. Awkward small talk? A rehashing of the past? Instead, we just talked about the kids, mostly how Maddie was thriving at college, how the little one wasn't so little anymore. She spoke with a warmth I hadn't heard in years, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a performance. It felt real. When we parted ways, I didn't feel closure in the way I expected. There was no dramatic apology, no perfect resolution. But there was peace, a quiet understanding between us that we both survived the storm. As I walked away, I realized the past didn't hurt the way it used to. Maybe that's what moving on really is, not forgetting, but finally letting go.
Keep watching our stories by clicking on one of the videos that appear on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be alerted about new videos. See you next time.